Good evening. On behalf of New York Small Farma, I welcome everyone to our third episode of Cannabis, Consciousness, and the Environment, Conversations with Community. Tonight's episode is a meet and greet with Sharon Smiley and Mandana Boushee, two candidates to the New York Cannabis Advisory Board, endorsed by New York Small Farma. I thank you for being here. I know there's no shortage of cannabis events happening, and so we truly thank you for taking this time to be here with us tonight. And we're going to try to make tonight as fun and interesting and informative for you, the viewer, as possible. Our intent tonight is to get a robust discussion going by taking your questions. So I will introduce the candidates and then we will take audience questions. So please do not be shy in writing your question in the chat, and I look forward to asking them to our candidates. New York Small Farma is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization that exists entirely on donations. Our mission is to foster a socially just, environmentally regenerative, economically inclusive cannabis community. We operate entirely by volunteers. If you feel called to donate tonight or in the future, we encourage you to do so, and we also ask you to please consider volunteering with us. We advocate for small-scale craft, outdoor-grown cannabis that is good for the environment, good for the consumer, good for the land where the cannabis grows, and good for the workers who grow it, as well as good for the community surrounding the farm, and ultimately produces the highest quality and healthiest product for you, the consumer. As many of you already know, in comparison to other states who have also legalized an adult use sector of the cannabis industry, New York's cannabis law is one of the most forward-leaning in terms of social justice and environmental protection. In addition to those provisions, the law sets up a structure of government for its implementation. Most notably, there is within the New York Executive Chamber an Office of Cannabis Management. At the helm is the Executive Director, Chris Alexander, and 5 Cannabis Control Board members who are appointed by the governor and the New York legislator. There is also a Chief Equity Officer, Jason Starr, who's responsible for implementing the social equity program. The law also sets up a Cannabis Advisory Board, where the control board cannot have a vested interest in cannabis. They cannot be farmers or processors or engage in any aspect of the industry. The advisory board, who is charged with advising and providing guidance to the executive director and the control board on all aspects of implementing the cannabis law in New York, can be members of the cannabis community. They can be growers, processors, people affected by the war on drugs, or have a vested interest in the outcome of the implementation. And they're also responsible for administering and governing the community reinvestment funds, which are those funds allocated to rebuild communities ravaged by racist prohibition policies. So selecting them is something that the public should engage in. There are so many layers and aspects to setting up a new industry, especially one steeped in social justice issues, reparations, and decriminalization, including release of prisoners. Tonight, I want to just touch on 3 broad categories: social justice, which includes economic inclusivity; environment, which includes impact to local communities; and education, from destigmatizing the plant to educating consumers on its health benefits, which are broader than just THC percent levels. So let's meet the candidates. Mandana Boushee is a native New Yorker born and raised and is committed to ensuring New Yorkers are at the forefront of cannabis legalization. She's an herbalist trained in her Iranian lineage and Western tradition. She grew up in a predominantly BIPOC community during the war on drugs and has witnessed firsthand the disproportionate impact enforcement of prohibition has had on her community. She's committed to seeing those communities rebuilt, as well as ensuring members from those communities are given opportunities and a level playing field. Further, Mandana has cultivated cannabis holistically for over 15 years, including in California, and has expertise in cultivating methods that holds cannabis, the land, the workers, and surrounding communities in reverence, while at the same time creating economically viable jobs. Welcome, Mandana. Thank you for being with us here tonight. Next, I would like to introduce you to is Sharon Smiley. Sharon is born and bred in New York, Brooklynite. He recognizes and has participated in legacy markets. Like many in his formative environments, he's witnessed his own parents, relatives, and friends fall to and struggle with the effects of the war on drugs. He is a financial advisor, a hydroponic farmer, including a cannabis cultivator, designer and builder of ecological buildings and structures that incorporate and respond to the complex influences of culture, aesthetics, and emotion. And he has also been a music producer for over 12 years. SirRoan currently works as an herbalist, renewable systems design consultant, and a food and plant sovereignty advocate. He's committed to being a channel for people, planet, and profit-centric advocacy efforts that are aimed at repairing injustices and encouraging earnest, inclusive practices in the New York cannabis markets. SirRoan, welcome, and thank you for being with us here tonight. Okay, I would like to just get right into the questions, and we have some questions that have been submitted on email ahead of time as well. And we have also questions from the audience. So one of the questions that was submitted on email that I wanted to ask right off the bat is, what is social equity to you? And how do you see it implemented in the New York cannabis industry? So either of you can answer this question.
I would invite Mandana to speak first, and I'd be happy to also address it.
Yes, hopefully we'll both double team on all of these juicy, exciting questions. But first, I'd like to start with gratitude. Gratitude for everyone in this space this evening. Gratitude to the host and to New York Small Farma and everyone in New York State pushing into this new future for cannabis. Yeah, I feel like this is a very complex question. And I think that in terms of thinking about an equitable future for cannabis as a medicine, we really need to address past harms that have been done in this country in regards to cannabis and the war on drugs. And that, I think, looks in many different ways, specifically in the community that I live in the Mexican-Tuck Valley, which is also known as the Hudson Valley. You will find that most of the sort of campaign and the war on drugs affected our cities. So that includes the city that I was raised in, which was Newburgh, Kingston, Hudson, and farther north up into the capital region of Troy and Albany. And so for me, I think reparations is sort of one of the foundational places to start. And reparations, of course, is not just an economic idea. It's representing and acknowledging harm and working actively to actually tangibly change our culture and the systemic issues that we face around cannabis moving forward. And so I think that takes a lot of work beyond optics and actually practicing what we preach, creating information and resources for folks in the communities that I'm a part of, being able to have access to land, access to financial coaching, business coaching, and things of that nature. So those are just some things I'm thinking on in this moment. Yeah.
SirRoan, did you want to add?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mandana. So yes, I'd like to also begin with gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to speak here, and gratitude for the selection and support of New York Small Farma. Also gratitude for the indigenous ancestors whose land we stand on in discussion of this sort of state and city-based legislation, right? We're going to talk about social justice, social equity. We want to begin with the recognition that, this policy, the regulations are starting with a debt, essentially, right? Starting with a debt to those who've already experienced injustice and social equity, essentially, attempts to address the concerns for fairness and social policy, right, in a broad sense, and the difference in between social equity and what we call equal rights per se, as that social equity should be addressing some of these debts, that we're not looking to fast forward into a current lens of fairness, rather begin to balance the scales that have been tipped rather intentionally for so long. So in some cases it looks like reparative justice, right? Going back and releasing prisoners, awarding skill workshops, grants, funding to communities. In other places, it's education based, right? We're talking about including elders and social equity from a social equity lens. How do we assign jobs, ways to employ oneself or be employed, that speaks to someone's current ability and what they can contribute, and what their contribution is actually worth. So there's a very complex equation, a recipe at hand here, that begins with the people who are affected for certain, and our voices and organization to sort of ripple from conversations like this to the policy level.
Thank you. Those great introductions from both of you. I appreciate it. So I'm going to read a question from our audience tonight. Thank you for your efforts and commitment to moving this industry forward, especially in the legislation for those affected by the war on drugs. My question is around being a certified minority-owned business in New York State, with the requirements for that being to already have a business that is at least a year old and generating tax revenue. How does the advisory board expect a new business entity to qualify for social equity in the adult use market? How will you address this?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understand exactly the question. I don't think that there is a requirement that you had to be operating for a year in order to apply, but perhaps I'm misunderstanding the question, but I would love to hear from our speakers.
Thank you for contributing this question, and I believe there are almost two different tracks in this question. There is the WMBE certification that has its criteria, and from what I understand, the social equity criteria for licensure in New York State does not require you to be WMBE. There are considerations for certain demographic, historic categorizations that are similar to the WMBE criteria, but they're not wholly the same. As far as addressing new businesses qualifying, there are a myriad of approaches, and I think fundamentally what we're seeking to see, or what I really support, is a multimodal regulatory process, right? Something that includes, things like, of course, adult use cannabis, no one left behind medicinal cannabis, but also things that expand into spaces like, cannabis use clubs, with freedom of association, that would allow for new businesses to be protected under the law to a certain extent of cultivation and trade within those clubs, which might address a transitional strategy to get folks, one, to establish trust within the communities that they are exchanging cannabis in. And I think kind of goes back that sort of goes back to the point about social equity, because some of these new businesses can be upstarts with no connection to cannabis, and some of these new businesses might have, quote unquote, new businesses might already have existing customers, right, from legacy practices and delivery services that already exist. So there needs to be some gradation in the scoring for inclusion, and we can get into more detail of that in a bit.
Yeah, from what I'm understanding from the question, what I'm finding it to be important and want to speak on is like this idea of like when New York State launched the CBD hemp program, a part of that launching, you had to pay, I think it was like $1,000 for the application fee. And then once you were approved, you needed to have like a certificate of occupancy, GMP practices, so good manufacturing practices. You need to have like proof of liability insurance. And then once you went through all of that aspect, then you had to pay an additional, I think like $3,500 to receive your licensing fee. So right there in and of itself, there's just so many obstacles for small growers, for folks who have already been affected and impacted by the war on drugs. And that already there is creating such a very clear boundary of who actually has access to these programs. And so I think that a lot of things that feel really important to me and important in our work, if we are to be a part of the advisory board, is to be figuring out programs, low interest or no interest loans, grants and writing grants and raising funds to not only support people who have been incarcerated for working with cannabis, but also making sure that they have a place within the industry and this new business landscape. Because when we think about people being incarcerated, it's not just, oh, they were incarcerated and now that record is expunged, right? They have the reality of the years of not being able to have work, sometimes having, their children taken away from them. There's such a long impact of disadvantagement that comes with being incarcerated that we sometimes forget about, because when we hear that the record is expunged, that almost seems like that's like the most important aspect of this idea of thinking about social equity when we're thinking about this new business frontier that we're going to be entering into with cannabis being legalized. So I think all of that work around grants and working on providing low interest and no interest loans is super important, because it also brings up the fact that a lot of banks don't want to like fund cannabis businesses. And so there's still a lot of stigma within the bank culture. So there's a lot of work that I think we could do as an advisory board to really be creating a structure where people like us can actually be a part of this business.
Thank you. Do you think that there should be special programs for individuals who were incarcerated?
Yes, I think that is a high priority item. So in addition, to Mandana's point, there are a myriad of effects, that sort of branch out from one's removal from, a valued member of society, right? And that includes time away from their kids, values not contributed, education lost opportunities, economic participation opportunities, struggle, stress, trauma, psychological fallout. There ought to be, now that we're positioning corporations and high net worth individuals, essentially, as illustrated in Mandana's point around, the CBD certification, and even higher still with THC, right, with adult use, hundreds of times higher in cost for accessibility. We're looking at trying to level a playing field that is so biased in one direction that it is unfair and unreasonable, unjust, completely unjust to consider directing revenue flow, tax dollar collection, and not including the losses assigned and attached to people's names, records, lives, and the impact on their families. So yes, I think funding that acts as a direct reparation fund for individuals who will be released. Um, for certain, there would need to be some sort of criteria for that, as with everything regulatory. But beginning the conversation of what that is and how to keep it as fair as possible starts here, and it starts with the public. So, as a participant in the advisory process, we certainly want to hold, more of these meetings, get more citizen feedback on what that looks like for people who are experiencing that directly, and some of the fallouts, within family structures that need to be addressed.
Yeah, echoing all of SirRoan's comments there, I think absolutely providing permits for people who, or licensing for people who have been impacted by their work with cannabis is a part of the repairing, and super significant. I think something that I find really exciting about this new frontier for New York State is that we have sort of this eagle-eye vision of what has already happened and what has occurred in other states who have sort of pre date the where we are in New York State. So we have California to look at, we have Colorado to look at, we have Massachusetts to look at. And I think when we look at what has happened and what has taken place in these states that have already gone to legalizing recreational use, I think something that comes up, especially with California, and Nicole mentioned in introducing both of us, that I worked out in the Emerald Triangle in Humboldt County with a lot of original growers. And what's happening there is that there's just completely a corporate invasion happening. And so in order to be able to receive the licensing and to receive the permits, you need to have access to a lot of wealth. And what's happening are the small farmers who have been, growing cannabis with reverence, and not just monocropping, and really thinking about the environmental impacts of cannabis and a part of the community, are completely being wrung out. And what's happening is that whoever is the highest bidder is who is being sort of brought to the front. So I don't want to see that happen in New York State. And I think the gift that we have in working in these advisory boards and in creating sort of this new way forward is that we can look from missteps, I don't want to say mistakes, but missteps, and really work to shape and sort of change that culture. And in a way of doing that is absolutely, making sure that people who have been most harmed by cannabis's dark history being centered, and being given access to these licensing, I think, is a really key way to do that.
Thank you to both of you for that, for those answers. I have a question from the audience that I want to read, but just to follow along this thread for just one more point. So there's a lot of talk about giving 50% of the licenses to equity applicants, but to your point that both of you are making, it's not enough to just hand out 50% of the licenses to qualified equity applicants. There also needs to be a level playing field that, as you said, with the large corporations coming in and big money and the pay to play that we've seen in so many other states, how does New York, what are the steps that New York needs to take in order to level that playing field?
It's really complex, and there's no way to sort of hit it on the head, I think, and but to sort of shrink the issue into the context of this conversation, I believe that there are certain licenses that speak to and empower and encourage business among small operators, and there are licenses that are clearly directed for, multi-state operators, corporate interests, investment groups to come in and dominate those spaces, right? And, to be just to call them by name, you know, the general cultivation license, the distributor's licenses, you know, for the most part, dispensaries, especially when they're sort of in groups, are going to be run by corporate interest. While on the other hand, we have licenses such as the micro business, cooperative licenses, and delivery licenses that can work in rather immediate fashion to support people who are ready to do people who are familiar with cannabis, who are smaller operators, to get a head start, and with less restriction on the licenses that encourage small business, and higher restrictions on when I say restrictions, I mean how many are available, not just 50%, but how many are available this year versus next year versus, right, how they're doled out, how they're phased in. Because if we say 50% of the licenses go to social equity applicants and 50 go to corporations, you know, the amount of funding associated with the 50 licenses that are not social equity will essentially drown or create so much noise in the space that small operators will barely have a chance to earn anything for themselves in such a fierce market driven by corporate interest. But on the other hand, if the micro business, cooperative licenses, and delivery licenses are pushed to the front with a scoring process that, you know, tilts toward small businesses, people who are affected most by the war on drugs, then we end up with a scenario where those entities, if they want to get into the marketplace sooner, would be forced to support, partner with, and invest in the smaller operators, sort of creating a funnel that starts from the bottom, so to speak, right? So, you know, we're going to fill it from the bottom as opposed to trying to top down the push forward into the economic boom of cannabis.
To add to SirRoan's comments there, I think it's also really important to think about, yes, 51% of licenses being put aside for social equitable change is an incredible first step. But then if we kind of pull the onion layers back, there's sort of the questions that come up of, okay, we're giving out the permits, but where's the land? And so I think a lot of the work that we as an advisory board are going to be having to do is partnering with local nonprofits around getting land back in brown and black hands, and partnering with organizations like New England Farmers Color Association Land Trust, partnering with the Black Farmers Fund, partnering with multiple organizations that are already doing the work on the ground of getting access to land and growing arable land for BIPOC communities. Because just giving folks the permits and the licensing is, you know, a great first step, but there's the land, there's also the education aspect. It's also coaching, mentoring people who are desiring to work with cannabis on a legal level, goes beyond just saying, here's the license. It's asking the questions of, where do you want to be in this new economy? Do you want to be on the growing side? Do you want to be on the manufacturing side? Do you want to be on the retail side? Do you want to be doing a mix of it all? And I think all of those pieces are going to be really important in creating an actual sustainable sort of way into making this a meaningful impact, and not just here's 51% of the licensing. You know, it has to go beyond that. And the other thing that it makes me think of is that in the early sort of marijuana, the early state marijuana laws, a big piece of that law was that businesses had to essentially, the term I think is vertically integrate, meaning that if you are a retail shop, you had to grow all of your own products, which really pigeonholes people who are interested in creating sort of cannabis businesses into an almost impossible place to begin, and also it ends up making folks feel like they need to lean into doing indoor growing, which I'm sure as this conversation unravels, we'll talk more about sort of the ecological impacts of indoor growing. And now Colorado has changed their stance on, this idea of vertically integrating, and now it's more diverse, and it makes it easier for people who want to come in different avenues in the cannabis economy. But I think all of those aspects are going to be really, really important in actually making sure that this like equitable push is going to go beyond just this like idea of here's 51% of the licensing.
Thank you. Okay, so to read another audience question, New Yorkers have been enjoying cannabis produced in New York State for decades. Many cultivars grown for the medical and recreational markets, as well as breeding programs around the world, were propagated right here in New York or Massachusetts, New York Diesel and ChemDog, to name just two. How will New York regs recognize traditional market cultivators with provisions such as a hold on recreational home cultivation after established medical operations will be permitted to grow? How are medical cultivators to obtain seeds that are not available for sale in New York, but widely available online? How does, sorry, my computer's just, well, how does this encourage growth of New York businesses? We are presently allowed to possess several ounces of products, but no legal way to obtain it in New York State. How will you address these inconsistencies in the proposed framework? Yeah, so I think there's two questions happening here. One, the question is, there's a you're legally allowed to consume cannabis, but you can't buy it in the state of New York. So you can't buy it from a New York cultivator. Or you can, but you're basically getting it on the street, which is coming in from everywhere. And the same now is happening with seeds as they legalize home grow. Do you guys want me to read the question again, or did you?
I think I get the gist of it.
Okay. So long.
Yeah, so it's sort of a you can say, how can you put a chicken before the egg kind of thing, right? And we're talking about beginning legal farming with seeds that technically don't exist legally within the state. And I think there's some space, for in the transitional process to allow for. So I'm going to make a reference to some other nations with cannabis legislation that have some space for things like this, particularly Belgium, Spain, Uruguay, with regulation around cannabis clubs. And these clubs provide, freedom of association. And within the freedom of association, you can consume and exchange cannabis. And I think, being able to join these clubs as individual operators, as individual citizens, and I would put preference to, small growers and local folks, Black and brown folks, to procure seeds and begin operating greenhouses, can begin to address it. We can establish seed banks, we can establish seed libraries, nurseries that are fostering, cultivars that are ready for this climate, especially. I think another slice to that is, the fact that how do I drill this down? The fact that the cannabis market in New York, as stated, is already very complex and robust. And, essentially what we're looking to do is assign appropriate the market and assign it to those with licensure. And there needs to be an acknowledgement of the legacy markets. And, to make space for that, it requires, to sort of step back from this idea of judicializing cannabis going forward. If this is to work in a truly socially equitable manner, we cannot proceed to say we're going to expunge records and then continue to judicialize, possessions of seeds, because it is, in essence, creating a void between those with tremendous amounts of legal lobbying power, capital, and those who don't have that.
Mandana, did you want to add to?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that, yeah, I liked that idea. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? And unfortunately, we're in a situation where, you know, cannabis has been legalized in New York State, and so now we're able to have a certain amount of ounces of cannabis on us, and that be okay. But we're probably still a year to 2 years out from actually having, shops and businesses that you can go to. Not only purchase cannabis products, but also be a part of a cannabis community that's visible. And so I think a big part of the conversation here, and I think SirRoan was already sort of speaking to it, is that, in every story, there's the visible parts of the story that are in the light, and then the shadow part of the story. And in New York State, I think the shadow is sort of the legacy businesses, the people who have been working tirelessly for decades, who have been creating and breeding seeds that are accustomed to our climate, who have a great amount of experience growing cannabis as a medicine and as a plant, with sacred intention. And I think a big part of the work we have to do is sort of bring balance to what isn't sort of what's the light of the story in this culture, especially in New York State, which is so beholden to the Rockefeller laws, of this idea that cannabis is a drug, that cannabis is marijuana, that cannabis is, under such a stigmatized sort of lens, and really rewriting that narrative and bringing the shadow into the story, and the shadow actually being really positive, and full of knowledge, traditional ways of growing, a true sacred reverence of this plant, and making that community visible, because that community is already here. And so I think a big part of our work in this advisory board is to help bring that culture into the light. And that feels really important.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read to you the next question. So we talked a little bit about the difficulties of minority getting access into BIPOC community getting access into the cannabis programs and licenses, and already the BIPOC community faces bias when they apply for loans for regular businesses, and with the Schedule I status of cannabis at the federal level, it's very difficult to get traditional loans, even if you are in a good way to get those loans. And so this is what this question, I believe, is speaking to. So the question is, although the New York cannabis licensing allows a lot of creative possibilities, there are many financial pitfalls and obstacles that outsource many minority candidates or even aspiring entrepreneurs. Is there a way we could provide resources, programs that aid and support the equity applicants, connecting them to? And I would say that the state of New York will be providing that, but I'm going to say outside of the state, in addition to what the state could possibly provide, what are the avenues for them to get investors?
I guess we have a pattern of me speaking first, so I'm just gonna so I'll just continue. Kind of drawing on. So there are a couple of avenues, right? Kind of drawing on precedents in other states and other territories that are operating, with adult use programs. We've seen that oftentimes larger groups will sort of scout for social equity applicants. And, there's no sort of regulatory structure that says what's fair or not, but they're left to their own merits and resources to vet what these negotiations and deals look like. And often these deals look like, in the music business we would call, just like a stamp, right? Like a 10% or 5% or some sort of carve out, but no true participation in the operation of the business. There's that, and we want to avoid that. And I think having regulatory consideration and protocols and parameters on how those deals are structured, because I think that it's a viable way for folks to move forward in the open market, so to speak. Simultaneously, community funds that are essentially non-government reparations, or at least reparation or community-centric funds that are intended to address particular issues like this, are also something that's viable. There will probably be some, a swell of grant dollars that come this way, but that's going to take some time. And I believe that, advocating for, public and private contribution to community funds is something that is, very much in, something we can apply attention to and get results for relatively quickly. Simultaneously, we can't, I bring up the point about Colorado and California specifically, and, the tendency for larger groups to invest or recruit social equity applicants, because there's no way that's not going to stop. And protection for individuals need to be built into that, and I feel like that is a perfect opportunity for those organizations to implement education, workshops, training. If you're going to go after a social equity applicant, then you want to make sure that they're skilled and ready to participate in the business with a substantial level of input.
Mandana, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I feel like on a community level and in terms of the work that this council would be doing, I think a lot of what I feel excited about to lead with in the work that we would be doing collaboratively is the community outreach, is like what I've kind of been saying a lot in this talk tonight of, creating and providing education hubs and ways to sort of educate and coach folks on the how-tos of upstarting a business, the how-tos of growing and working with cannabis, financial coaching, also helping people sort of translate the languages of walking into a bank and trying to take out a loan when you are a brown or Black person. And I think that like the educational piece is so important, because it's, I think, something that we all need in terms of moving forward and feeling like we do have access and we do have a place at the table. And then on the state level, as you already said, Nicole, I think they're already sort of allotting funds towards making sure that there is a sense of support for BIPOC communities to be able to get going in these businesses when sometimes they're already at a disadvantage, especially if folks have been incarcerated regarding like cannabis work. And I think what that makes me think of too is like, how can taxing cannabis and how, when New York State licensed sales, how is that going to have sort of a positive implication on our economy? And how can that ensure that people who have been disproportionately harmed buy cannabis and the war on drugs get to actually participate in this new economy. So I think there's a lot that as we sort of unfold and this new legislation unfolds, that can happen around the cannabis tax, and that kind of channeling back into supporting BIPOC community in regards to the new law.
Thank you both. Those are very good answers. I'd like to, I'm going to have read a couple more questions, but I also like to be able to, before we end our program tonight, to discuss environmental concerns and social equity as it pertains to social equity and in the cannabis industry. So just keep that in mind. But here is another question from the audience. What are you going to do to stop pass-through exploitation or manipulation of minority and women-owned business to serve as fronts for a large corporation or hedge funds who are going around looking for MWBE to be the front/face of a company for 3 years while the white company, quote unquote, manages, sorry, every time somebody writes a question, my thing jumps while I'm reading it. Anyway, and the gist of the question is, which is something that also I find also concerning, is we hear a lot of these companies that have already established themselves and brands that already established themselves in other states that want to move into New York, or large companies that are funded by people that aren't equity applicants, that are looking for equity applicants to sort of be the forward-facing front of the company, and then they slowly, you know, currently as it stands, the equity applicant has to own 51%, but then these companies are going to slowly buy out and take over companies to where it is no longer an equity applicant, it is no longer an equity applicant owned business. And how do you guard against that sort of game playing? If I can find the question again, I will reread it.
Well, in California, we know that process is running rampant. That approach is very traditional. It's a traditional strategy where, you know, JVs and corporations will step in and make these, you know, short-term contracts that give the equity applicant or the equity, the person who qualifies for social equity, you know, a stake that is nominal in comparison to what the value of the operation is, and sort of push them out, sort of tokenizing or, you know, using them as a front. I think there's enough evidence in the legislation, in the sort of tax history, and, you know, for the 2,000 equity applicants, you know, something like less than 200 actually get selected, and then less than, you know, 10% of those have the resources to get started, and then most of them end up scouted this way. You know, having, you know, some access to what some of those agreements look like, and what how that history has played out, are things that we can bring as case studies to the control board, to New York regulatory bodies, and state that this process is predatory and we need to address it before it becomes the same thing in New York. Because once that begins and once it's allowed, it'll be very difficult to rein in.
I agree.
I mean, I guess the first thing that I feel like is important for me to say is that I'm a gardener, I'm a farmer, I'm a grower, I'm an herbalist, I'm a healer. And so when it comes to sort of this, like, you know, thinking about large corporations or hedge funds, sort of tokenizing, having like a BIPOC or a woman leading sort of face, but it really being this like dark, looming powers sort of being the strings to the puppet, I immediately feel like I think in sort of the more big radical ways of like, how do we change that power dynamic? And I'm not afraid to say that I'm not coming to this circle or this space having like done a lot of like sort of large governmental organizing. I mostly work with nonprofits. And so I guess with that like perspective, I think something that's important to say is that I think we need to be making sure that the policy around corporations buying large swaths of land for industrial production needs to be limited. Corporations aren't going to have interest unless they are able to do something on a very large scale. And so if New York State can come in and have really fierce laws around industrial production, which California doesn't have, and what happened in California was even before cannabis became legal, large corporations were already buying large swaths of land in preparation to start their sort of industrial corporate size monocropping growing. So I think if we can sort of scale back and create policy around the size of what can be grown, that's going to really, I think, help with this sort of dark sort of side of things.
I agree. I think I agree with you 100%. I think limiting the size will affect that, as well as the environment, which I would love to shift our focus to at this time. So can you guys speak a little bit about one of the things that we support here at New York Small Farma is outdoor regenerative grow. And it's because, one of the intents of the New York law is to improve climate resiliency. And when you grow a plant outside, it sequesters carbon and it literally contributes to climate resiliency. When you grow a plant inside, it contributes to the carbon footprint by the nature of the grow operation. Can you guys explain a little bit about what regenerative farming is and how it relates to social equity? Would you like to go first?
I'll change things up.
I was gonna say, yeah, that's what.
Yeah, I mean, for me, regenerative farming is basically how my grandmothers and grandfathers grow. To me, it's indigenous technology. To me, it is, we put these words like permaculture and regenerative farming on very old ways of knowing. And a part of sort of my learning and understanding of tending land comes from decades and decades and decades of my ancestors sort of working with the land. And so I think in order to sort of center regenerative farming in New York State, we need to center the indigenous people that live on this land, who have lived on this land and have tended this land with such beauty and intricacy and very, very adept technologies. And really centering that in this conversation. And a big part of that, to me, is bringing sort of knowledge around the benefits of growing outdoor. I think something that's really interesting to think about is in Colorado, predominantly most of cannabis there is grown indoors. I spoke earlier about this idea of vertically integrating, which means that retail shops have to grow their own products. And when you grow indoors, you're basically essentially creating an environment that replicates or reflects what an outside environment is. So that means you are bringing in lighting, you're bringing in fans to create wind, you're bringing in hydroponics to bring in water. And all of that is creating so much greenhouse gas emissions. And so a few years into Colorado legalizing cannabis and cannabis being grown indoors, there was a study that was put out by Colorado State University. And I think it said that, indoor cannabis growing accounted for 1.3% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions. And to sort of put that into context, coal in Colorado was estimated at like 1.8 or 1.9%. So coal and cannabis indoor grow are basically equal. And also it's important to note that 80% of all like greenhouse emissions from indoor production comes from practices that are specific to the method of growing indoors. So if we are able to sort of start in New York State with outdoor growing and encouraging people to be growing outdoor and with greenhouses outside, that's going to be really starting us off in a footing where we aren't going to be, starting off ecologically in a negative. And I think that's super, super important. When I was working out in California, there were so many people who were growing cannabis in holistic ways, growing cannabis not in a monocropped way. So it's not just rows and rows of cannabis and only cannabis. They were growing cannabis with medicinal herbs and vegetables, which was bringing many pollinators. And what that looked like was thriving gardens that were grown in companionship, with reverence, with ritual, and the plants were healthier for it. There was less fertilizers used because people were using compost teas. And also there was, water being collected from the rain instead of pumped up from the rivers. But that was what I was witnessing because I was working with original growers and communities who had the earth and in mind and reverence in mind, where majority of people who are growing in California are growing with greed in mind, wanting to have the most pounds. And that means pumping their plants with pesticides. That means pumping the Eel River dry. That means, the erosion. There's just so much ecological devastation that California is facing because capitalism is centered in growing there. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in New York State to not grow in that way. And what's beautiful is that where I live in the Mohican-Tug Valley, which is commonly known as the Hudson Valley, is we're a community of farmers. And a lot of us are doing farming in a way that our ancestors would be proud. And so I think that we have the possibility to really start out growing and sort of showing people that growing outside is actually where the plants want to be. And we have seeds and practices where plants can grow long term and become, fully primed to be able to harvest and have really, really beautiful medicine to share with our communities.
Thank you. And SirRoan, can you also speak to, when you answer this question, just the impact that environmental degradation has on BIPOC communities? In the same way that the war on drugs disproportionately affects those communities, oftentimes we find that environmental degradation and injustice lands squarely on the shoulders of those communities as well.
Yes, I'll start with that then. For the most part, when you look at, air quality measures for different communities and neighborhoods, you can spot by zip code, which is really scary, the concentration of pollutants in atmospheric particles in particular areas, right? Which says a lot because, we're sharing air, and air is pretty diffuse. And, for there to be, disproportionate air quality suggests that there are active outputs in those communities that tip them, make them more at risk than others. For instance, Brownsville's air quality is far worse than the air quality in Bensonhurst, right? Although, the economic spread between those two communities aren't as drastic as you might say, Brownsville and Park Slope, right? Where property values are, 5 times as high. So, when looking at the overall environmental impact, we're talking about exacerbating environmental impacts, environmental ecologies that already exist in a subprime group of conditions where illness related to environmental conditions are already higher in these communities. And as we begin to amplify those with the general ecological degradation, we're tipping those communities further off balance, and they're sort of exponentially, they impacted exponentially worse for it. And sort of to back up on, sort of the justice and equity and environmental sort of lexicon that we're exploring here. I think there are a bunch of things that Mandana struck on that are just really resonate. And, as an herbalist, as a person who sees, medicine and food as a right, for all beings to live in a way that is humane, and to see that it's not just capitalism per se that is causing the issue, because if from a purely capitalistic perspective, the cost of operating environmental degradation is a losing proposition, right? So it's, if you look at it on a scale, just 10, 15 years out, the way you would measure a real estate investment, it is clearly lopsided and it's a losing proposition. But it's also the lack of reverence for the current generation, the generations that follow, to have the humane right to participate and breathe fresh air and eat good food and have good medicine, have healthy bodies, so that they can live worthwhile lives on this planet and in this territory that we inherit. So I think the incentivizing what some nations, some countries refer to as kilometer zero markets, right, where the amount of emissions associates, that was my cat playing the piano too, 0 kilometer emissions markets, right? Emissions markets, essentially speak to the level of offset of carbon, within that operation, whether it's indoor or outdoor. And now, granted, the cost and the availability, the ability to do that on an indoor grow is going to be far more complex than it is with an outdoor grow, and it should be, because indoor grows are inherently unsustainable, right? Just as by definition, just like us living in cubicles with our air conditioners and all the things that we do in this current construct is anthropomorphic. This is man-made. It's sort of forced, and we're pumping energy and all the resources in order to sustain this thing that, if left to its nature's merits, would completely break down, right? And then on the other side, is there a way to set a criteria and standard for those growers to have limitations, restrictions, and meet all of the benchmarks to make an indoor grow qualify as a kilometer zero operation? Yes, right? There are ways forward, but you need to dare to do that. And I believe that scoring operations based on their willingness to comply with that is afforded, is especially available in New York with the body of legislators that are present. I think we're in an unprecedented place within New York legislation, with the personnel, the people who represent New York is unprecedentedly diverse, as well as the need for land, for access to land, becomes a striated thing, right? When you talk about who owns that land, how many people can we get land to? Do they need to displace their current lives to go participate in rural growth scenarios? And as much as I support that outdoor growing is preferred, for sure, I recognize that for the sake of social equity and inclusion, that there needs to be some avenue and definition to allow for ecological scoring, like a kilometer zero market, sort of like a new market credit that you would get for putting in solar panels, and utilizing compost teas and collecting local ag and food waste to offset various inputs and outputs that come with cannabis cultivation indoors. And thinking of outdoor cultivation, yes, I agree. The regenerative farming, permaculture, these terms are placed on indigenous technologies that have been informed by hundreds of years of ancestral practices. Many people sort of risk their lives to carry seeds and practices with them into oppressive scenarios, and the value of this technology is immense. That said, some folks, despite that being available, still don't do that, right? They're pound oriented, profit oriented, and they're pumping tons of fertilizer that cause eutrophication in the bodies of water, soil degradation, which is very challenging to reverse. It takes 10 years, to get that soil to operate something like it was before breaking it down over 2 or 3 seasons. So, looking at scoring these things and placing, agricultural practices that are centered in community-based philosophies that support, generations going forward, not just of human beings and their net worth, but generations of birds, generations of microbes, generations of trees and herbs intercropped with cannabis, right? Because we're talking about another herb, to incentivize monoculture agriculture for the sake of it being quote unquote outdoor, I think is also a slippery slope that we want to be really specific as we look at what we are advocating for in at the quality of grow and the social and environmental impact that we want to see come out of this beautiful opportunity with this sacred medicine. Yes.
So thank you for that point. I think that you're right. Not all outdoor grow is equal. Large scale industrial farming has failed, and we wouldn't want to import that model. So, but maybe Mandana, you can address. I think you spoke on it a little bit. If we are to support and promote outdoor grow, then there has to be some type of approach for land access to allow for women and BIPOC communities who have been historically underrepresented in farming and in fact had farming literally land taken from them. How do we strike the balance between somebody who wants to move and become a farmer to be able to access the land while waiting for, you can't buy land and hope you're going to get a license, and you can't pay for a license and hope you're going to get land. So how do we strike that balance? What is the onus on the state? What is the onus on the advisory board?
I mean, when I think about the future of cannabis 10, 15 years from now, I envision community gardens that are filled with acorn trees and hickory trees and cannabis and anise hyssop and roses and okra and eggplant all mixed together, and people from all walks of life growing beside each other and harvesting all of this food and medicine together, not just focusing in on cannabis as a crop that can provide a lot of income. And so I would really love to see community gardens built around cannabis. And I know that when CBD became legal in New York State and Vermont, there was an increase in sort of theft of people's harvests. Because there's sort of this scarcity culture already so ingrained in the Western mind of, coming to the new world, the new land, and seeing all the resources that, there was no one here and it was for the taking. And I think that when we lead with scarcity, that's kind of going to be the result. But I think that ways that we can sort of advocate for people to have a transition to having access to land when they don't necessarily have land themselves is creating cooperatives, working with organizations that are already land trusts that have social justice and equity values at the forefront of their work, creating environments where people can come and learn how to grow before they jump into a business to see if that's something it's even the part of the business that they want to enter into. I think it's important to think about the fact that a lot of people who have worked in the Black market for 10, 15, 30, 40 years aren't necessarily have been in the growing aspect of it. And so I think it's really important to provide education on growing sustainably, growing outdoor. A lot of times I think people get so overwhelmed at the idea of this small cannabis seed growing into a plant that can sometimes become 15, 20 feet tall. And also, where do you go from there? The harvesting, knowing when it's the right time to harvest, the curing process, trimming the plant. All of those aspects are super, super important in creating sort of like a sustainable business model. Moving away from clones, advocating for starting from seed, teaching people how to sex plants, teaching people how to grow male plants for seed, having seed farms, these seed libraries. I just immediately go to sort of the visionary thinking, and and like saying that I also honor that we have so many steps to get there. But I do think that starting with the intention of like stepping away from a scarcity capitalist mindset and having community land for people to start to explore not only the knowledge sharing of growing cannabis, but also working with the land and having the opportunity to grow cannabis and other vegetables and medicinal herbs. Partnering with land trusts and getting land back in Black and brown hands are all sort of great places to start while we're still building the bridge to this new cannabis future. With that said, we have sort of the four bullies that we sort of have to always be looking over our shoulders. And those are really giant industries. And those industries are the tobacco industry, they're the pharmaceutical industry, they're the alcohol industry, and they're absolutely the agricultural industry. And so I think it's going to be really important for our council to be sort of already prepared for big ag orgs like Monsanto wanting to come and, take away our seed sovereignty. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work that we need to be doing on the community level to make sure that we not only have sovereignty to grow this plant and have access to this plant as medicine in our communities, but also carrying the seeds forward, carrying these regenerative practices forward. And really, it's like a battle with these industries in mind.
So we have just about 10 minutes left, and I want to pose one question to both of you that it's going to sort of be a little bit of a catch-all question, and then I'll close the discussion for the evening. So I'm combining two questions that we had. One is discussing, I think it would be good to compare how this new industry could mirror that of the small craft brewery or the wineries. But also, one of the things that the regulators are talking about is taxing based on THC percent, which the whole concept of surrounding THC percent is infuriating to me. But, we don't see extra strength, et cetera, and have a higher tax, or full flavored cigarettes have a higher tax. And so, can you speak a little bit about that in comparison to how it can mirror those other industries, the importance of unlimited licenses for small businesses, and why is unlimited important, and why is staying small important? So those are some big things to tackle here in the next few minutes for both of you. So thank you. Who would like, we want to go first?
I'll be happy to go first.
SirRoan, there you go.
Yeah. So, I think as, mirrored in the wine, spirits, and beer industries, I mean, even in food, right? We have, very resilient craft sectors of each of those industries. And, in beer, spirits, and wine specifically, that looks like 20 to 30% of the entire market share. in various territories. It may shift, some percentage points, but that's sort of the scope of where that lands, and I think that says a lot. Um, Granted, in spirits, that 30% market share, will be divided amongst 1,400 producers, and you know, to prepare ourselves as a nation, as a state, for this reality that the resilience of craft production, craft purveying, operation for in general is a very strong strategy, and to essentially allow for unlimited micro businesses, cooperatives to get to the ground first, and sort of allow for New York to be essentially a craft marketplace, with a very limited amount of large operators in the space. I say limited because I find that political precedents, will almost never exclude big capital from coming in and having its influence in the marketplace. But I don't think it's necessary at all, for the simple fact that the current marketplace exists and the revenue exchange is rather robust, and none of these operators from Colorado and California operate here, and we're doing pretty okay. We just have an opportunity to get this all above the line, have people's rights protected as they participate in the marketplace. So I think taking the truth that we already have very much a craft and small operator centric marketplace, and allowing for the individuals, the citizens who are most entitled to have that grow and benefit them in a way where protections and their value can be seen to its fullest is essential. And because there's already such there's such a track record for craft in other industries that are comparable to what we want to see in cannabis post prohibition, we can take those lessons and invest in them, while avoiding the missteps, so to speak. Corporate participation corporate participation kind of brings me to a point where I want to wipe the sweat off my brow, because it leaves like so many wild cards and questions as far as how policy will be affected, despite the errors and flaws in those practices, right? Because of the economic impact. But I'd say, I'm willing to stand behind, having New York be a much more craft marketplace than we've seen in any other cannabis, adult use state or nation so far.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like New York State is sort of leading and at the forefront of micro businesses, and especially here in the Mexican-Tuck Valley, the Hudson Valley. We have such a ripe community of self-employed small business owners, and we have such a sort of support and focus on small businesses that's already in place, and something that people come to the area for. The Hudson Valley is famous for small farms coming here to get the products, the value added products here. Also in the Finger Lakes region, they're also, you know, experiencing sort of like a wine renaissance. So people will travel to Ithaca for the day, visit a winery, and then have a glass of wine, maybe buy a couple bottles. The same goes here in the Hudson Valley. So seeing that model happen with cannabis, to me it seems like a very seamless transition to a very similar model. And I also think it's important to note that in California, the Department of Food and Agriculture there is right now laying groundwork for like a sort of certification program that would essentially like create standards for cannabis labeling. So kind of when we think about, you know, when we think about wine, for example, and we think about France, there's certain areas in France that are known for their wine. So, you know, we think of Bordeaux and we think of, you know, but you know, you get the idea of what I'm trying to say here. So right now in California, they're trying to create sort of this certification program so that in the Emerald Triangle, cannabis products that are coming out of the Emerald Triangle would have a label on it that says like, you know, homegrown from the Emerald Triangle, and people will think of good cannabis, and sort of that idea of terroir would come into terpenes. So I definitely think that a model like that, having sort of a certification program that could add labeling to cannabis products would definitely help with the micro businesses, and creating sort of a standard of certification in a way that would be definitely beneficial to small growers here, especially in the areas of New York State that already have such a historic agriculture like center. And for me, I'm specifically thinking of the Hudson Valley, and I'm thinking about you know, the Ithaca region and the Finger Lakes region as places where that could really shine.
So we just have a few minutes, but we do have one question on legacy conversion that maybe just one person could answer very succinctly, and then I can close this out, which is, you know, California has failed to convert their legacy market. It's because it just didn't do well, and it was either going to lose operation by converting or just stay legacy. And also there's a lack of trust from those communities that have been mistreated effectively by the government over prohibition. How do you build trust with those communities?
Mandana, do you mind that I grab this one? I think it begins with a general step to cease judicialization and criminalization of, you know, what we know as health hazards and a health issue, right? Drug use is, and drug abuse specifically, you know, not even categorizing cannabis as a drug, because that is flawed logic. But, you know, let's say in general, drug use and abuse, which is what we're trying to prevent with, you know, these with prohibition laws and the war on drugs, so to speak, are throwing, you know, violence essentially at a health issue. So the trust needs to begin with, you know, ceasing the judicialization, criminalization of drug possession, right? If the individuals who are experiencing, you know, and have experienced incarceration, persecution, investigation, loss of employment for, you know, due to the associations, can witness the state sort of change its position on these larger issues that include the area of risk of being a cannabis possessor, operator. It makes some space to begin, you know, being more creative around having things like, you know, social clubs with cannabis use, NGOs that protect, people's, right to share information, seeds, and practices, you know, processes that allow individuals to, gain, letters of, present letters of recommendation, and testimonials from parts of their community to show that they're a trustworthy, operator, and they can take the community building, the market building that has been established through the legacy operation, forward to present, as an opportunity to be legal.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to say that we've come to the end of our time. So I'm going to have to, we're going to have to conclude tonight's episode. We will have these recordings up on our YouTube page for you to watch. Please subscribe to our YouTube page. We'll also create a page on our website to answer the questions we were not able to get to in tonight's episode. We will send those links out for those pages in our newsletter. So if you have not signed up for our newsletter, please do so through the homepage of our website. We try to send out news blasts through our newsletter every week. We sometimes miss weeks. We're an all volunteer organization taking on the state of New York. So we're not always able to keep all the plates spinning all the time. We sometimes have to prioritize the focus to continue to ensure that this industry and its community is socially equitable, environmentally regenerative, and economically inclusive. But we do keep everyone apprised of the important developments in the state of New York, and we also have a few guest authors that are helping us with blogs. So if you sign up, you will definitely be given all of the information. And again, we exist entirely on volunteers and donations. So if you feel called, please donate or volunteer with us. And please follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And we'll be updating our website soon and creating clear avenues for how the public can voice their opinions and engage with the regulators of the New York cannabis industry. So whether you participate through us or another organization, we encourage all of New York within the cannabis space, consumer to entrepreneur, to get and remain engaged and active in this process. I really want to thank you for being a part of tonight's program, for being here with us. I definitely thank so much to the nominees, Mandana and SirRoan, and I'd like to say, thank you to them very much for indulging us in your vast knowledge and wise thoughts, and we wish you the best of luck in your pursuit to be on the Cannabis Control Board. And if you support these candidates, you can write into the governor and the legislators to say that you do support them, and we'll have on the website how you can do that. I'd also like to take a moment just to thank our board of directors and all the volunteers who helped put this together, especially our board member, Tosi Eji, who directed tonight's program and did a fabulous job, and we thank her so much. So until next time, thank you all for being here, and good night.